you'll notice as you go through all kinds of charts that you'll see that these changing crosses that are in that last segment of the line, that there's much less of them obviously in the population. So you're going to deal much more with 1-3s than 1-4s. You're going to deal much more with 2-4s than 2-5s, and so forth and so on, because they're always going to be a small aspect. Yet at the same time, that shift is enormously important. They are a link. As you can see, what happens is that that unconscious fourth line, when it gets to the next level, to the second line personality themes, you see it's the bridge that goes up from the first line to the second line. That at the unconscious level, it's linked by the same unconscious. That in the same way that, the personality links this way, the unconscious is always linking the other way. In other words, every single one of these profiles are interconnected to the next one. So the moment that we have the 1-4, we open up the possibility to actually move in the genetic program. We get to move through by jumping to the 1-4, then we can finally get to the next step and go up to the 2-4. So we always have this movement going on. Obviously, we're going to have a real change. There's no question about that. But if we had a 1-3 and a 1-4 together here in the room, and we knew them, we would have a thing about their personality they're very similar. Obviously, the personality is going to stay the same. But the unconscious is very, very different. First of all, the fourth line is upper trigram. Now what that means is that when you're dealing with the fourth and fifth and sixth lines, because they're upper trigram, they do have transpersonal potential. They have transpersonal potential in the sense that they know there's somebody else out there. And they know that the other is going to be important for them. Now the other is important for the fourth line very differently than for the fifth and sixth lines. The fourth line is the line of externalization. It is about being very fixed. And that fourth line is the foundation of the upper trigram. So it has the same kind of need for solidity that the first line has at the very beginning. So when you're dealing with a 1-4, you're dealing with something that's very fixed. This is not the authoritarian personality that can break down by realizing that the foundation is weak and become an anarchist. This is not somebody who's ready for evolutionary change. The 1-4 is saying, the foundation is fine, I'm going to externalize it. The 1-3 says, wait a minute. And the 1-4 says, the foundation is fine, I'm going to externalize it. In other words, they're very fixed, and they're not interested in the potential of anarchy in that. They're just saying, it's there. So, we began with the behavioral identity of the 1-3, and what we saw was we had a martyr, the investigating martyr, and now we have the investigating opportunist. This is a very, very different creature. This is somebody who's waiting for their opportunity to externalize the foundation. That's it. They're waiting for their opportunity. Now think about what the fourth line is all about. The fourth line is very fixed. We know that. It's going to be externalizing. It needs to externalize. The fourth line is the theme of friendship. The fourth lines, wherever they are in your profile, all fourth lines have an excellent capacity to befriend others. It's part of their gift. That's why the 4-6 is such a great voyeur. Because they can make friends while at the same time unconsciously staying aloof. So they watch. All fourth lines need the other in order to have somebody to externalize to. So the 1-4 is not like the 1-3. The 1-3 has to wait for somebody to bang into it. The 1-4 is waiting for its opportunity to externalize its foundation. And of course, it isn't about whether that foundation is right or not. You've got to be very careful with 1-4 children, that you don't send them off on a really bizarre path, because they really need solid things, because otherwise they're going to be externalizing in a very fixed way all kinds of stuff that's going to meet tremendous resistance. Fourth line, the opportunist. There's a wonderful theme about the opportunist. Never leave your lover till you have another lover. Never leave your job till you have another job. Very important. And if you leave your lover before you have another lover, you're going to have a hard time finding a good lover. And if you leave your job before you find another job, you're going to have a hard time finding a good job. It's the most important thing for an opportunist to understand. So here we have the 1-4, we have the investigating opportunist. And when we come to the projected attitude, we have the authoritarian personality, but instead of having the anarchist underneath, now we have the abdicator. Oh, this is very different. In other words, the difference between the 1-3 and the 1-4 is that when the 1-4 meets somebody who says your foundation is nonsense, they just back off. They abdicate. They don't change. It's not like because you show them that it's wrong that they're going to suddenly change what they've been fixed with from the beginning. They will just abdicate. They'll just back away and wait for the opportunity to meet somebody that they can externalize successfully to. In other words, if the person they meet does not accept that there's apartment buildings on Mars and that they have photographs to prove it, they'll wait for the next opportunity to externalize that truth to somebody who will accept it. And then they'll be very happy with that person. I met a guy like that. It was absolutely wonderful experience. I was doing a lecture in Berlin, and at the end I get this guy come up to the table with his girlfriend who, all she kept on doing was raising her eyebrows. I mean, endlessly, just the eyebrows just kept on going up. And he takes out this portfolio and lays it on the table for me. And he's showing me pictures of Mars. And he's showing me, there's a parking lot, and there's a statue of Jesus, and that's where the airport is. And, he had this wonderful mad look in his eyes. I really liked it, eh? So I just sort of humored him and went along. And her eyebrows were going up and down. This is classic 1-4. He doesn't... And you can't do anything about it. And of course, like anything else, this is not about good or bad or anything else. The fact is that we need to be able to externalize all kinds of things, everything. And these are people that do it really well. And one of the nice things about them is that when they try to show you all of that and you don't like it, they don't make a big deal out of it. They abdicate. They simply back away. And they wait for their opportunity to find somebody else that they can do that with. The limited perspective. We saw that the third line, unconscious, is pessimistic. And that the pessimism can grow by finding out that more and more of the foundation is faulty, that it doesn't really operate correctly. Now here what you have is fatigue. Is one of the difficult things about the fourth line, the 1-4. I mean, it can get exhausted trying to find people that it can externalize to. And it gets exhausted with people. It's got to go through this whole trip of making friends with them. And remember, it's all coming from their unconscious. So it's not like they're comfortable with all of that. And then they get totally exhausted. They keep on showing that portfolio over and over and over again, looking for somebody that'll say, yeah, right, So there's a great deal of fatigue in all of that. They can really get burnt out by other people. And again, this is one of the things about children. The 1-4 child really needs to be nurtured carefully because after all, they can be very, very powerful beings. I mean, human beings are always impressed by people who are fixed. It's one of the things that, human beings find impressive. They see somebody staying with their thing and, these people are so deeply like that if they're given the right material to begin with, if they're nurtured correctly, then they're going to be a lot healthier as beings. Again, this goes back to their design. This is purpose, after all. They're here to live out that purpose. It's not like you can get in the way of that. But they're only going to live out that purpose successfully if they're living it out according to their nature. Again, this is one of those things about whatever line you have. If in talking about third lines, you can get carried away and think, Jesus, But if you enter into things correctly, You're not going to pay a price for having a third line profile. So it's very important for these children, for anyone who carries fourth line themes, they have to be clear. They're externalizing forces. And of course, they're going to be externalizing to the other. They need friends in their life. So they really have to have things that are of value to externalize in order for them to feel good about themselves. The aspire to role. Now, the 1-3, we saw this, the beauty of sustainment. That 1-3 says, all right, the foundation doesn't work, we'll build a new one, I'll tear this down. And they stay with things, they work with things, they go through that whole process in depth. And then you get to the fourth line unconscious, and it says, leave me alone. This is creative aloneness. And it is one of those things that is very healing for the 1-4, is to have its opportunity to live out its creativity alone. In other words, these are people that cannot be creative communally. Doesn't work for them. They don't belong in communal arts, as an example. This is a distinct theme of being deeply creative in your own aloneness. And of course, that creativity can add so much depth. It can bring so much richness into the 1-4 life, because after all, they are really here to know something. They're here to grasp something at a deep level and to be able to put that out into the world. Yet a lot of that means that because they're a first-line personality, because they have this chameleon need to be introspective and to get into things, they need time alone. Children in the same room. It's one of those horrors, because there's certain profiles that should never be forced to grow up sleeping in a room with a sibling. 1-4 has to be left alone. They need to have their own space, and they need to have their own space from an early point in their life in order to have that time to be alone, to learn to see that in being alone, they get important work done. There are some profiles, for example, 6-line profiles, in which the major part of the work is done much later in life. And there are many profiles where the real work is done early. For the 1-4, this is very important early work. In other words, these are children that need to be focused at an early age, and focused according to their nature, obviously, but focused into things that they're encouraged so that they can really get into them, get really deep in them, and be creative in that, so that they can go out there and externalize and feel healthy. The other thing is, if you have a fourth line unconscious, one of the things to keep in mind, like in the 1-4 and the 2-4, is that there's all kinds of people that want to befriend you, and you don't know why they're there. The first line, after all, doesn't know there's anybody out there. It's personality. But that fourth line unconscious is going, hey, I'm available. Come over here. I'll be your friend. And that first line personality is saying, what are they doing here? Why are they here? I have so many fourth line unconscious people who say to me, I say to them, you have this social blah, blah. And they say, yeah, but why are they here? What do they want? What do I have to do? So when you're dealing with that fourth line theme, unconscious, and you got a first line personality that says, is there anybody out there really? I was looking at this book. I didn't know there was anybody out there. All of a sudden I have to deal with all of that. So the early part of their life, where they're more sheltered, if they're properly nourished, if they can get into their creativity, they can get the main part of their work done. And then they're going to be a lot healthier when they go out there into the world with that kind of, opportunity, the people coming at them. They can find the right kind of people for them. Sexual strategies are really funny. Here with the 1-3 and the 1-4, they're both pursued, so they're both got cavemen personalities. They both really want to be able to go out there and just get them. And then you have this fourth line unconscious. The 1-3 says, I'm going to go out there and get them, and then I'm going to divorce them. That's basically its movement in life. And the 1-4 is different. It says, I want to go out there and get them, but what you're looking at is that the sexuality is the confidant or not. In other words, You have to go out and get them as a friend first. Now, this is the whole thing about fourth line themes. The nature of the fourth line is that the fourth line is about friendship. It is about brotherhood, sisterhood. Now, that is a sexual strategy. It's a strategy that says, I have to become friends first. And when I become friends first, if we get to know each other, then at some magical moment, usually a very boring moment for the two of you, you cross the line from friendship. Well, after all, need the stimulation. You cross the line from friendship and you end up in sexual intimacy. Now that is a fourth line theme. That's what the fourth line has to do. Now, if you've got a teenager that's carrying a fourth line profile, it can be very difficult for them. Because, what they end up having, you've got the 14-year-old boy with the fourth line unconscious theme, and he's got all these very pretty girls who are friends. They're telling him about their lovers. They're telling them about the boyfriends they want, and he's friends. They tell him everything. He goes out to lunch with them. He goes home and drives them crazy, because he would like to be one of those lovers. And, of course, and gender-wise, the other way around. It can be a girl with a 4, and she's the friend of all the boys, but, none of them are the boyfriend. So that fourth line theme, the moment you understand it's a strategy, I tell everybody with a fourth line profile, the moment you meet somebody and shake hands, that's the beginning of foreplay. No joke. That's the beginning of the whole process. So the 1-4 has a different way as a purpose. Remember, this is purpose. This is the way in which they have to live out their purpose sexually in this life. It's for them to recognize that they have to pursue the friendship first. And if they pursue friendship first, they may end up with exactly the right kind of intimacy that they've been looking for. However, they can't afford to be caught up in the frustration that, they can only be, in that sense, friends. They have to see that at a genetic level, that's already hooking them into the other person, and there will be that moment, there will be that opportunity to cross that line. Now, one of the things to understand about friendship is that friendship at the emotional level, the fourth line at the emotional level, in other words, all the fourth lines of all the gates in the emotional system, that all of those fourth lines operate out of a wave, and that wave is kindness, meanness. Now, that's very important to understand in terms of fourth line sexual strategy. You become friends, everything is kind. So you become friends, and they tell you all about their lovers or their past lovers or their problems, and you tell them all about yours, and you're real buddy-buddy, and then that boring moment comes, and the two of you cross that line into intimacy, and then you wake up the next morning, and the kindness has turned to meanness, because the moment one of you does exactly what you described in your relationship to the others, you point it out. You're not going to treat me the way you treated her, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So kindness can easily become meanness. And one of the things to be clear about is that if you've got a fourth line strategy sexually in your life, for you to recognize that you have to hold your tongue. Anybody that you become friends with that you're really interested in, don't tell them all that stuff. Talk about the weather, because it will come back to haunt you. Right? So be careful with that. Fourth line. So what you have in that fourth line being, the 1-4, this is a different person. They have a lot of social interaction in their life. There is a disappointment in their life. That disappointment is that if they can't find somebody who will accept their 1-4 externalization, however, their whole capacity here, to be able to be a real authority. I mean, that's one of their things. To be able to be a real authority and to be able to be the source of other people's need for strength. 1-4s seem to be like oak trees. They seem to be very, very solid beings. You can put your arms around a 1-4 and you're sure that you're not going to fall over. That's why they make great friends. And of course you have to remember that because they make great friends, they end up fatigued by having all kinds of people tell them all kinds of stuff. I mean, the thing about the 1-4 is the 1-4 is desperate to externalize their truth. And what they get is everybody else telling them their stuff, and they get exhausted. They're always waiting for their moment to get their 1-4 business out, and everybody is telling them everything else. Finally, the security strategy. Now again, we're dealing with a first-line theme of being a self-provider. And think about the nature of humanity. It's a self-provider coveter. This is the basis of what it is to be in the world. You covet. I see that they're going to post the 10 Commandments in schools in America, which I think is hilarious. However, because there's this great section on thou shalt not covet. I won't get into all that. But anyway, I have my black sense of humor. Coveting. If it weren't for coveting, we would never have come out of the forest. It is just the basic drive in us. Now, it doesn't mean that to covet has to become an obsession, nor does it have to be, whatever. I'm not a moralist, so it doesn't really make any difference to me, but for some people it seems to make a difference. But nonetheless, coveting is natural in order to get to the point of self-providing. So self-providing is a very basis for us in life. And all first lines are going to be caught up deeply in that process. That need to be able to look after themselves, to be able to provide for themselves is very dynamic. However, when we saw the third line unconscious in the 1-3 profile, we saw that, the moment that you can't self-provide, you quit. In other words, you break the bond. You find another way to self-provide. I mean, you keep on looking for it. You're looking for the foundation that will really be able to provide for you. And if it can't provide for you, then you say this is a terrible foundation. You tear it down as an anarchist, and then you go looking for something else. When you're dealing with the unconscious of the 1-4, you're dealing with the benefactor dependent. Now remember, I told you that that first line never wants to be dependent. It wants to be a self-provider. But the 1-4 changes the game. And the moment that you have the 4 unconscious, what you have is somebody who is ready to be and willing to accept being a dependent in order to get its opportunity to be the benefactor. In other words, it's ready to accept that as part of friendship in its process. It often is looking for support, after all. The fourth line carries a strong missionary theme. In other words, because it's able to externalize, it can go out there into the world, it can really get things out there. And so it can really end up being a deep benefactor for others. But it may have to go through periods of dependency. This is not a quitter. It's not a 1-3. It's not going to break the bond. It's even willing to be dependent until it can get to that point that it's recognized. So it will put up with the friends that are telling them all of their stuff as long as they can finally have its opportunity to externalize its thing. Now, they're a small fragment of society. After all, you're going to have an enormous number of 1-3s, and you're going to have a much smaller number of 1-4s. So this is not going to be a dominant theme. And of course, what happens is that each of these binaries that you see in the lines, we tend to lump the personalities together. And by lumping them together and treating those personalities in the same way, it can create enormous problems at the unconscious level. Remember that a 1-3 and a 1-4 at the personality level, they look the same. They got the same basic themes. So they're going to come out in that way. And all of us tend to be more aware of the 1-3 because we meet it a lot. And yet the moment that you're dealing with the 1-4, it's a different story. So there are real subtleties that are taking place at the unconscious level that we need to recognize. And that 1-4 being has a very different way in which it starts its process than the 1-3. That the 1-4 is a child, for example, that you can give dance or piano lessons or whatever the case may be, and they can end up doing that for the rest of their lives. Whereas the 1-3 will end up doing many things. It'll break the bond, whatever, until it finds something. It finds a foundation that works for it. But that doesn't mean it's going to come right away. If you have a third-line profile, you always have to see that trial and error is your process, that it's going to take you 40 years. 40 years before you really get to a point that you've accumulated enough trial and error experience to be stable and to be comfortable in the way in which you live in the world.